I'd like to welcome everyone to CSIS. My name is Michael Matera. I'm the director of the Americas program. We'd like to welcome those who are here today who braved the cold and the sleet and the ice and the snow. We had over 100 RSVPs. I think people will be coming in slowly over the next 10, 15 minutes, but the weather outside is pretty bad. But for those of you online who aren't having to suffer the weather, welcome also. This program is being streamed live around the world. Our CSIS Venezuela initiative is one of the most important initiatives that we have here in the Americas program, if not the most important initiative, given the importance of this issue in the Western Hemisphere. Our focus has ranged from scenarios and day-after planning to a close study of the humanitarian crisis, to groundbreaking work on applications of blockchain and cryptocurrencies in addressing the humanitarian crisis. This initiative has been largely the work of one person, with the help of a lot of others, but this has been led by Moises Rendon, our associate director, who we have worked with now for 2.5 years. Moises has done a fabulous job in covering the Venezuela scene very, very widely from one side to the other. And we all acknowledge that, Moises, and thank you for your commitment to the cause of Venezuela and to what we are trying to do here at CSIS. So Moises is going to be moderating the program this morning, The Hidden Power of the Venezuelan Diaspora, and you're going to be hearing about a number of the initiatives that he and the CSIS Americas program have been working on. But thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everybody, for braving this weather here in DC. I know it's difficult sometimes to wake up and see all this snow coming, so thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you those watching online as well. As Michael mentioned, we have many more people watching online, so thank you as well for those watching online. Just briefly, the video webcast is going to be available after the event finish on our CSIS website, so keep an eye for that for those who are not able to watch it live. So perhaps we have, one of the most impressive panels covering an issue that is not really being covered as much as should be, which is the role of the diaspora in Venezuela. This is a very diverse panel and was put that in place on purpose, and the ways that the diaspora can help are very different. So we're really looking forward to have a different perspective and learn from different ways and tools that the diaspora can be leveraged now to help the Venezuelan people. So yes, our discussion, as Michael said, is going to be where those tools were the policy options for the Venezuelan diaspora, who today are about 4 million people outside of Venezuela, a country of 30 million people, so it's quite significantly. But yes, let's just jump in into the discussion. We have 5 panelists, very brilliant, and really delighted to have all of them here. But first, we're going to start with Magali Sanchez. She's a professor, a senior researcher, and visiting scholar at the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. Professor, we're delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for coming all the way from Princeton University. And Professor Sanchez has studied international migration to the U.S. with a special interest in the construction of Latino identities. And you all have her bio packet with you as well as with the other panelists. So I welcome you to read the full bio and at your disposal now. Professor Sanchez is studying the international migration of high-skilled and educated individuals from Venezuela and other countries in the U.S., right? And I really want to say this because every time I talk to an expert in Washington and outside of Washington about what's going on in the migration issue from an academic research perspective, Professor Sanchez was always a person that people point me at. So thank you again, Professor. It's an honor to have you here. And again, the dynamic of this event very quickly is going to be, we're going to try to have a very dynamic. We have 5 people. I'm asking each of them to cover about 5 minutes of remarks. I'm going to follow up with a question of each of them. I'm going to be introducing each of them briefly as well. So We will try to keep it dynamic, and then we will open it up for Q&A at the end of at the last 30 minutes of the event. So thank you for being patient. Professor, as I said, you have studied international migrations in the U.S. with special interest in the construction of identities. What are those main features? What are the main characteristics of this Venezuelan diaspora? What type of skill are we seeing? What type of age? What type of income level? And what type of features we've seen in this diaspora? And give us your diagnosis in how you see the diaspora taking shape.
Thank you for inviting me to this fantastic panel, and thank you for the colleagues to be here. We're going to discuss several important points related with the diaspora. I'm sorry. Okay, so yes, it's a huge responsibility, right, to do a diagnosis in the migration from Venezuela. But I have been concentrating basically in the wave of Venezuelan to United States since 2000. And we start to do research, and we have data. We do analysis in data in 3 data, which is the American Community Survey, the survey called the Latin American Migration Project, which is a survey applied to Venezuelan immigrants, and several in-depth interviews. So that's basically the data. The data have been contrasting with global data, which is the American Community Survey, and is coherent. In other words, the finding that we have are perfectly backed up by the global data of Census and American Community Survey in the United States. This data showed that the wave, from 2000 to 2013, that we recollect the data, is really high skilled professionals. The profile was intentionally searched to describe this population, which is master and PhD, basically. The data that show the American Community Survey, I can refer later on, is important and really highly educated population in the United States until in 2016, which showed that people from Venezuela who are still coming to the United States are very well qualified. Also, in relation with the population of the migrants that have been going to the South, I recently joined a network of knowledge with academics in South America related with migrare. It's called migrare in Spanish. And this has been a recent recollection data in principal cities of Latin America where the wave of migration has been going on. And it shows also like a very important profile in terms of qualification and professional skills. This has been a survey run in the cities. It's not a survey run in the borders of the countries. And I would say exception made for this really vulnerable population that is still in the borders of Colombia, Venezuela to Colombia, and other borders of Colombia with other countries that are extremely vulnerable. I would say that the profile of the migrant population to the rest of the world is very well qualified. The diaspora option is something that emerged in the literature and in general in the reality when you are assisting, right, to the crisis of migration or crisis in countries that you see enormous amount of population that migrate to the rest of the world, and these populations are highly qualified. So what we call the diaspora option is actually a way to contrast those old theories of brain drain, brain lose, and as a way to capture these highest skilled migrants that are around the world and intentionally organize and trying to connect to the original country in order to develop projects of development or in order to develop projects that will face humanitarian crisis, in order to develop projects over platform of knowledge, the network knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. In this sense, the option, the diaspora option, is something extremely important and rich to be considered only in that way. So you can have different levels of diaspora. The first level of organization, like network organization, this is an example of network diaspora, right? We are some Venezuelans that we are organizing. We agreed to coherently talk about our experience on the Venezuelan crisis and diaspora, and we are creating some kind of echo and knowledge over the media, over the population that are listening to the problem, right? That's one thing that is very important. The other thing that is extremely important is everything related with the remittances. So we know for sure that when you have an important wave of immigrants, you have labor remittances. We know that, right? People go out and send money back to the people that stayed there. But the key is how to pass from labor remittances to a collective remittances, and how to convert those collective remittances in projects that are related not only with development, but also with other issues that are extremely important. For example, populations in high level of vulnerability create one other level that is extremely important is the creation and the practical activities related with political lobby in international level, etc. But I think one of the most important is what are the ways that higher skill, which is the qualification or the characterization of the migrant population in the world, can coherently agree to establish several projects that can help in the situation of Venezuela. The main problem here, and we can talk about different examples of diaspora that have been successful or no, the main problem that, in my opinion, face the Venezuelan diaspora is the situation of the original country. And that you can see reflected in different aspects. For example, the late and the slow answer that different governments, or the difficult answer that different governments have in the region to face this recent crisis of migrants, because it's millions of millions. We know for sure that no country is ready to receive millions of population in 1 or 2 years. But the fact that it's not a coherent policy is also related with the way that these different countries' government have to face the government of Venezuela, because the government of Venezuela continue to deny the exit of population, the millions of exit population. So everything will be reflected there. That's one thing. So that's the paradoxical situation. The country is under a government that is practicing specific policies, authoritarian policies, and the vulnerability and the deterioration and the collapse of the system is one of the major challenges, because one of the conditions to be successful as a diaspora, and I will finish soon, is to have a very strong institutions in the country of origin in order to be able to develop projects, different projects, etc. So I will close here, and maybe during the discussion I can.
Thank you, Professor. I do want to follow up with something that you mentioned, and you know, it's the need of having a regional response to the migrant crisis in coming out of Venezuela, right? And so I want to ask you, what are those main barriers that the migrants and the diaspora in general are facing when they leave Venezuela? And what are the main challenges for those to insert themselves into foreign societies? And because I know you have studied this issue for a while, and I know it's not limited to Venezuela. So what are those main challenges? What are those main barriers that you see that migrants and diaspora in general are facing when they leave their original country?
Yeah, I think it depends where you go. I mean, like if you go in the United States, it's a system or it's a society that have a system that really work in terms of visa. So you have possibilities to apply in different levels. And if you are qualified, perhaps you have already a precedent network that facilitate that integration, I would say. In terms of the rest of the region, and I think right now there are some kind of green flags that are openly say, oh, we have a population that can be integrated in society. So Colombia is more in that direction, openly in that way. But I was seeing one of the problems are right now the equivalence of and the evaluation of your degree. So usually those take so long time. And I understand, for example, in Chile, I think I have new experience about how to evaluate I know that it happened with doctors, basically, how to easily or faster evaluate the credentials of the professional. Because one terrible thing that happened here is that it's a lot of difficulties in the country of origin to be able to get your passport, to be able to get all the papers that you require to prove who you are,
Yes.
right? So that's one thing. And then is because the same problem that it has been a huge amount of people that arrive suddenly, there is no a clear open policy to integrate those migrants. So I will leave that there, because in Latin
Yeah.
America it's not a problem of language, I would say.
Thank you, thank you.
Exception of Brazil.
Exception for Brazil, that's
Yeah.
right. Francisco Marquez is the executive director of Visión Democrática Foundation. He's a brilliant Venezuelan lawyer, political activist. He's a former political prisoner who spent about 4 months at the military Sevin jail in Caracas. Is that right? Yes, and turn that the mic.
Yes.
And
Intelligence
he
police.
was forced in exile soon after he was released from that military jail. And then before his imprisonment in June 2016, he was chief of staff of the mayor of El Hatillo, and David Smolansky, who is now leading the OEA's working group for migration and refugee issues in the OEA's again. But perhaps more importantly, Francisco went to the law school, to the best law school in Venezuela, which is the UCAB, Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. I'm not saying that because I also went to the same law school, but it is a fact. Thank you, Francisco. He's also known as Pancho Marquez. Thank you for being here. We're delighted to having you. He's leading this NGO now called Visión Democrática. It's based in DC and is now coordinating efforts from the Venezuelan diaspora, among other things. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership on this issue. Thank you. Just to kind of put a couple of questions, and I know you want to jump in very quick, but what is Visión Democrática doing? What are you guys doing? Anything related to the diaspora? And so, yeah, tell us a little bit about your NGO and anything else you want. Yeah.
Thank you, Moises. We've been talking about the diaspora for a while, and really happy that this panel is here, and thank you for your presence. Visión Democrática as an NGO was founded in 2012. I've been executive director since 2016. And really, my story is like millions of Venezuelans, unfortunately. A lot of us leave our country by no will of our own. And like many Venezuelans, I've had to reinvent myself. And really when thinking what's the best way or how can I add value here in the US, I love the name of the panel, The Hidden Potential of the Venezuelan Diaspora, because it's very clear from the get-go, especially when one of the first people I talked to when I got here was Professor Magali, who has been a mentor, and I really appreciate it. And she immediately talked about high-skilled migration, and it seems obvious, but when you look at the data, it's even more profound and even more surprising. And so, you know, when I was 4 months in prison, one of the things I learned is in face of immense crisis or horrible situations, it really helps just to focus on one thing that you can actually work on. One of the things that you actually can do on a daily basis. And what's really within our control, we can't necessarily change what's going on in Venezuela right now directly, we can influence it, but we can focus on things that we can add value. And the immense human capital that represents Venezuelans abroad can have a tremendous impact. We've seen other diaspora create much impact when they start to organize. Now we have to understand that as Venezuelans, this is counterculture. We're not used to migrating. This is not something that we've done historically. We're actually used to receiving people in our country. So it's almost like a double tragedy that from an individual's perspective and from a society perspective, we're still learning how to do this. We're learning how to become part of another community. We're learning how to organize ourselves and help Venezuelans abroad. And we're learning how to bring cultures to other parts of the world. I always joke that 5 years ago it would have been impossible to have an arepa, 2 blocks from an office. And now it's very easy. We can have arepas. We can have contact with our culture. So in terms of the diaspora, there are a lot of things that we're doing. In Visión Democrática, what we decided to do is find tools and mechanisms to integrate the diaspora to the social and economic development of Venezuela. And it's really about strengthening diaspora networks. In my point of view, we looked at what was out there. There are about 140 organizations registered in the US, much more worldwide. And we realized that where we can add more value is helping create those synergies, helping create those coordination, those spaces for coordination, and get people to know, because there's a lot of initiative. Amazing initiatives, and they're still starting up, and I think we can really get to the full potential. I wanted to add a little bit of context to what Magali was saying. First, this is the largest migration crisis in the history, at least in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. I would say, I think, generally, if you look at the numbers, they're astounding. It is a life action crisis. I think none of the official numbers right now do justice to what's actually going on. In fact, I love to hear Laura McGorman's on Facebook data on just how fast the migration is, because the UN numbers tend to lag behind. And so, when looking at all of this, we decided that we needed to research it, but we also needed to do concrete steps to help diaspora organize. And there are many things that are being done that I will get into. So first, the diaspora is not a homogeneous group. There are a lot of high-skilled individuals, but more and more Venezuelans that are coming to Colombia, Ecuador, even the U.S., they come in very precarious situations. That we hear that basically the NGOs in Miami are completely they're booked with capacity. They can no longer attend as many migrants coming in. There are many homeless Venezuelans in Doral, in Miami, in different states, and this is an issue. We are seeing not such a homogeneous migration group, and it's important to attend both realities. From our organization, we've seen it's important to get to the high-skilled individual, to the human capital element, to the person that's better established, but it's also important to attend to those individuals that are coming in here in very precarious situations, and that's one aspect that we always highlight in our work. There's a couple data points that I think are interesting and things that are being done right now. So first, you have to think of when you look at the diaspora organizations, we've almost become like a development agency. And because if you look at the 140 organizations, we looked at the 990s. Those are the public filings that every NGO has to do. These are only, mind you, registered NGOs. This is a very conservative number. We saw that they spent in their programs between $8 and $10 million for Venezuelan programs. That is a massive number, and it still, in my mind, underrepresents the type of funds, time, and human capital that can be invested into the current Venezuelan. And that's really only taking into account programs in Venezuela. If you look at the donations that are given to other migrants, it's even bigger. Our NGO, we just did a small drive here in DC, and we were able to recollect over 1,000 coats to send to migrant Venezuelans in Colombia, because many Venezuelans don't have codes. So there are things that are being done right now, but the potential is massive. And in terms of the resources being put in Venezuela, it's not just for philanthropic purposes, but remittances, as Magali was saying, but there are also personal donations that fall out of the purview of organizations. You have no way of telling them. I've heard countless stories of people either helping not just their family members, but other friends to either provide medicines or provide sorts of goods. And I think I want to quote Susana Rafali and other humanitarian workers. They said that if it wasn't for the Venezuelan diaspora and other outside goodwill ambassadors, to say in that sense, the humanitarian crisis would be even worse. They've been able to look at it that it continues to get worse, but in certain areas, they've managed to staunch the bleeding a little bit, and that is to say that there's so much more we can do. Lastly, just to round off and hear your question, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of moving forward. So one of the big challenges right now, as I mentioned, is we're in the midst of the crisis. So when you're in the midst of the crisis, it's a little bit difficult to organize. As I mentioned, think about, especially in places like Colombia, where you have 1.5 million Venezuelans, you're looking at least another million in the next year or 2 years. There's just no way for Colombia to handle that alone, and no way for Venezuelan diaspora organizations to handle that alone. You need international support for sure. It is the same in other countries. So we are over capacity in terms of attending the crisis when you look at the established organizations. And a lot of that has to do with our legal status. So, if you want to add another layer to this problem is many Venezuelans don't have current passports. Many Venezuelans don't even have passports to begin with. So there is this identity issue that makes it very difficult for Venezuelans to have a complete legal status with which they need to work, and if they start working, they can start the virtuous cycle back to Venezuela. So there is that bottleneck in terms of legal status that I feel that the international community and us in diaspora organizations really need to push for. There needs to be some sort of special consideration because of the documentation issue that really Venezuelans can't do anything about. If there are any Venezuelans here, they know what a nightmare it is to deal with the Venezuelan embassy. You hear that a Venezuelan really shakes in fear every time their passport is about to expire, because it's very difficult to get a new passport, and never mind those who can't pay dollars or access passports in Venezuela. And lastly, one big challenge, and this is where I think some of the panelists, I'd love to hear your thoughts, is scalability. Right now, there are different platforms, but it's very hard for Venezuela to say, if I want to help Venezuelans in some form or capacity, either a migrant or Venezuelan, how do I do it? There's not a big enough platform where everyone can get to. It doesn't have to be one platform. It can be decentralized, but I think one of our biggest challenges at Visión Democrática and to other organizations is how do we scale this model so more and more Venezuelans can participate to create more impact, and how do we make it easier for Venezuelans to participate and help. Those are big challenges, but I have high hopes that we'll get there. It's going to take a little bit of time because other diaspora communities have done it, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Pancho. Great. So the second part of the panel will be talking specifically more about what type of tools are at the diaspora disposal to actually engage on this issue, right? And we have three different type of tools. First, we're gonna be hearing about the role of the medical doctors in the diaspora, right? How they can be engaged to helping on the health type of service. And then we're gonna be talking about the role of the social media, specifically Facebook. What type of platforms Facebook offers so that the diaspora can engage again on this type of vulnerable communities and vulnerable issues. And then lastly, one of my favorite research topics is the role of cryptocurrency in this crisis. Venezuela, as you know, is one of the most important hubs for cryptocurrencies in the world. This is a market that is only increasing. So what is the role, if there is any role for cryptocurrency, and where are the opportunities and maybe the risk of this issue? But first, we're going to be hearing from ALEXANDRA WINKLER, and she's a liaison of MEC Global Venezuela, University of Miami, and she's also former deputy mayor of El Hatillo, a municipality in Caracas. ALEXANDRA is a public affairs and policy strategist with over 10 years of experience working for public, private, and nonprofit organizations in Latin America. And she's also a global shaper from the Caracas Hub, the Global Shapers Community is an initiative of the World Economic Forum. And now she's dedicated to studying the impact of the Venezuelan crisis and how to coordinate healthcare and designing this type of medical service in Venezuela. MEC Global Venezuela, and I think I do really want to mention that MEC Global Venezuela was an initiative inspired through different discussions that we held in CSIS. Michael Matera, Dr. Hermes Flores, and Dr. Sahir were discussing how can we organize and coordinate medical doctors in the diaspora so they can engage and go to, for example, the border with Colombia, the border with Brazil, to facilitate their knowledge and expertise to mitigate the suffering of the Venezuelan people. So ALEXANDRA is part of that team. Thank you, ALEXANDRA, for being in such an important initiative and for your leadership in so many other issues. What is MEC Global Venezuela doing? How did they got formed, and what are your plans moving forward?
Well, thank you, of course, to Moises and Michael to actually creating those inspiring conversations, because MEC Global Venezuelan program is actually a reality nowadays. Recently, MEC Global, which is an international emergency response organization, partnered with the School of Medicine of the University of Miami because they want to start sending medical aid missions towards Colombia, looking to alleviate the impact of the migration crisis, but also to attend directly the healthcare situation, which we all know. Unfortunately, now Latin America is dealing with the whole health holocaust that Venezuela has created. So we are all aware of the numbers. 3 million was just said last week by United Nations of Venezuelan refugees around the region, over 1 million in Colombia, over 500,000 in Peru, over 220,000 in Ecuador. We all know the numbers. We all know that 5,000 people are actually migrating every single day from the Venezuelan border. But behind each and every single of those numbers, there's a person. And that's what we're focused on. All those persons have the common denominator of actually arriving to these neighboring countries in very grave and dire human conditions. The common denominator is malnutrition. The common denominator is diarrhea. The common denominator is HIV, nowadays especially. The common denominator is starting to spread many eradicated diseases around the region. Just to name a few: malaria, measles, yellow fever, chikungunya, Zika, tuberculosis. They're actually creating this whole health holocaust during the region because of lack of healthcare in Venezuela. So the truth is, no country was actually prepared to receive the impact of this human landslide. So just recently, that's why international aid, as Pancho was saying earlier, was so important. And international aid, not only from organizations and NGOs, and of course multilaterals, but also from Venezuelan diaspora. And we hope to share a success case on that very soon. That's why medical missions, just like the one created by MedGlobe and University of Miami, are so important. These two organizations have created a perfect marriage. Why? MedGlobal, led by Dr. Zahir, brings to the table the necessary experience in order to attend each and every one of the most vulnerable countries around the world and their populations, whether they were impacted by natural disaster, whether they were impacted by forced displacement, whether they were impacted by poverty. Since their foundation, they have been deploying missions to 8 different countries. They've been to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. They have been to Sierra Leone after 11 years of internal conflict, especially with the 2014 Ebola break. They've been to Bangladesh serving the Rohingya community. They've been to Greece with the thousands of people and sea arrivals that receive daily. They've been to Yemen and to working with the millions who are displaced due to the tensions between the political tensions between the government and its opposition. And their most important success case is Syria. Syria, as you all know, is the biggest migration crisis of the world. And due to that, they made Syria an absolute priority. But the main success key for that Syrian program to actually continue to be successful was that they engaged with Syrian diaspora in the United States. They actually partnered with the SAMS program. SAMS is the Syrian American Medical Association, which has over 1,500 grassroots members. And many of those members actually engaged with the program and were able to bring a lot of healthcare and medical attention. That's why MedGlobal and the University of Miami find so important organizing diaspora communities. Why? Because they not only participate as nurses and doctors on the medical missions, they become spokesmen of those initiatives. They partner with those initiatives. They start carrying out advocacy. They start educating communities. They start influencing policymakers. They look a way to develop infrastructure. They find the funding. Many of these organizations, the first medical missions, the Syrian diaspora were the first ones to hand out the money that was needed in order to find the funding. And the great thing about all diasporas is that they look to find a way to create coalitions. And I want to make emphasis on that because there's a great American Relief Coalition of Syria, which is a great opportunity to broaden the outreach of the diaspora groups, but it's also an incredible organization in order to prevent any duplication of diaspora efforts. So creating coalitions is just as important. So MedGlobal is looking to replicate its Syrian experience with the Venezuelan diaspora, and that's how University of Miami also comes to the table, because they are the strategic partner in order to organize diaspora medical communities in such a strategic point as Miami. For example, Dr. Hermes Flores, who leads the University of Miami in the School of Medicine, has always been working towards the USNS Comfort Hospital ship, which is just arriving today in Bogota, not in Bogota, in Colombia, but through Rio Hacha, and who was just a few weeks ago in Ecuador, and how over 900 people are working towards that effort in order to provide care on board or on different land-based medical sites, helping once again to prevent the impacts of the healthcare crisis. And of course, the medical community in Miami has been creating Venezuelan task forces in order to bring together to the table former healthcare ministers such as Jose Felix Oleta and Carlos Walter, who also have input on how to work with the Venezuelan crisis. So thanks to all of these inspiring discussions, we're actually having our first scouting mission after Thanksgiving. We will be visiting Cucuta, but we will also be visiting Cartagena and Valledupar because the Colombian government has actually really made a demand to find the way to spread the medical attention towards the Caribbean Sea and towards the Caribbean areas of that country. Everybody thinks Cucuta, Cucuta, Cucuta. Right now, the Argentine White Helmets are on their way to Cucuta as well, which are great partners, but they also want more impact in other areas other than north of Santander. So after we have our assessment, we see with which organizations we can partner with and what resources we have on the ground, we will be sending our first medical mission in January. So if you guys know any doctors or any nurses who would actually be available for that date, please send them our way. They can sign up in our website and on our social media, medglobal.org. And we just hopefully soon, we know we're going to become a successful case of how Venezuelan diaspora can actually engage and just creating our ultimate goal, which is to help all of those in need. So thank you very much, Moises.
Thank you, Alex. I do want to follow up a quick question. You mentioned the MACGlobal model is collaboration with different NGOs, different organizations. I have on my notes that you educate local workers, you collect data, and you train local healthcare workers. And so, if you want to spend 1 or 2 minutes explaining to our audience what type of collaboration MACGlobal Venezuela needs from global organizations, from academic organizations, from UN bodies. Can you expand a little bit of what type of collaboration you need from these organizations that are listening to us right now?
Sure. Well, the first is the most evident one. We need funding, which is the most important part in order to, we already have the scouting mission covered, but when the medical missions, we have the objective to have medical missions for the most part of next year. That means it's going to be a big budget towards that. So the first objective would be to find the funding. And second of all, we really need human resources. Just to have an idea, each medical mission can be deployed per week or per 10 days, and it would be great, for example, following the Syrian model, to have at least 20 doctors every single 10 days or 15 days or week. So as much human resources are also needed in order for these medical missions to be deployed as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Okay, Laura McGorman, Portfolio Manager and Data for Good at Facebook. And Laura leads Facebook Data for Good efforts on the policy and partnership side. And prior to joining Facebook, she worked at the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce and focusing on data products and services for the U.S. government. She also spent 3 years at USAID and working on the sub-Saharan Africa and malaria type of control programs. Perhaps more importantly, she was an intern at CSIS not too long ago under the Africa program. So thank you, Laura. This is your house. Thank you again for coming back to CSIS.
Just a little bit ago, but thank you for having me back. It's a bit of a homecoming, and thank you, Moises. I'm humbled to be surrounded by such regional experts. So I'm Laura. I do manage the Data for Good program at Facebook. And so insofar as that relates to the Venezuelan diaspora and ways to effectively respond to the crisis ongoing not only in Venezuela but in neighboring countries, I thought I might begin by sharing some lessons learned from a lot of the work that we're doing in the disaster response space, because I think that there are similar stories and lessons learned that can be brought to bear to respond to the Venezuelan crisis. I also think that when it comes to the work of the Venezuelan diaspora itself, that there are a lot of tools on Facebook that can be leveraged to effectively network and grow this community to really organize. So on the data side, one of the biggest disasters that we've responded to in the last year is Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And we worked with a group called NetHope to not only restore telecommunications. So Facebook, if you can get on Facebook, it's a really good proxy for whether or not you have access to the internet. And what we found is that by aggregating information of whether or not people are able to get on Facebook, you can create a very accurate map for where internet is available. And so the first step that we did with NetHope in Puerto Rico was to restore telecommunication across 100 Wi-Fi hotspots to the communities that needed it most. And what we realized that we were then able to do once telecommunications had been restored was to leverage social media as a way to share information as aid. And so by working with NetHope a group called Action Sprout, and then a news agency called Internews, we created a Facebook page called Information is Aid for Puerto Rico. And we worked with a variety of trained citizen reporters to create two-way communication, not only from affected communities outward to tell their stories about the services and support that they needed with the world, but also ways for the Puerto Rican diaspora to support communities back home. And what was powerful about this work is because of the work of organized citizen reporters who were sharing really meaningful stories about what was needed on the island, this Facebook page grew faster than many others in Facebook history, and over weeks and months following its launch grew to 1.5 million users. And so I think that that speaks to an example of where we can centralize, where we can build coalitions, where we can organize our efforts to engage diaspora communities. They really can have an impact in effectively responding. Another body of work that we've been doing to try to better support migrant communities is actually a partnership with UNICEF that's focused on resiliency mapping of schools. So as my panelists have mentioned, we all know that there's a huge number of Venezuelans living in Colombia, and it's not just grown-ups, it's children as well. And part of the challenge of school systems is to better understand the services that they have available to absorb these kids. And so what we've been doing in partnership with UNICEF is to actually map the availability of telecommunications among school districts so that international NGOs can better position their efforts to help schools more effectively respond not only to natural disasters, but to better support vulnerable populations that they absorb. So those are just some examples of the work that I believe more effective data sharing can do in this work. I also think that Facebook as a platform and the products that it's offered are really important for the Venezuelan diaspora. And I'll go through just a few examples. So we see, in terms of Facebook groups, over 50 groups created by Venezuelans or for Venezuelans in Colombia alone. And many of these groups are built, honestly, as affinity groups to build community of Venezuelans in particular cities, but many of them have very tactical resources that are being provided. We see job posts being shared. We see tips for people who are recently migrating to the country and individuals trying to share meaningful information about how to integrate and how to get started. Similarly, on the Facebook pages side, we see a wide variety of Facebook pages by nonprofits that are trying to support the Venezuelan migrant and refugee community. We also see Facebook pages as an opportunity for people to post where housing is available and where people may want to rent a room. And last but not least, right now active on Facebook, there are dozens of Facebook fundraisers created not only by nonprofits, but by individuals, members of the Venezuelan diaspora, seeking to send medical supplies, to send food. And so I think that this shows that not only data, but the Facebook platform and its products itself can be really effective tools in effectively engaging the diaspora and hopefully allowing us to build more effective coalitions to respond.
Thank you, Laura. I just want to follow with a quick question. I mean, Facebook is becoming such an important tool right now for the Venezuelan diaspora. The vast majority of the Venezuelans fleeing the country are young. They're using social media to organize themselves, to reach out for help, to even for fundraise, as you mentioned. So it's becoming a very, very, very important tool. But for the people inside of Venezuela, there is a big problem right now, which is the internet access. And there's many issues where the internet, stop working, including my own family. Every time I try to reach out to my mom, it's an issue because she doesn't have Wi-Fi, she doesn't have the internet. So it's a very, very important problem. And I remember your CEO is trying to, expand the internet access in other regions in the world. So I don't know if you can share a little bit with us if Facebook has a role on increasing internet access to vulnerable populations and how is so? Thanks.
Sure. I mean, a lot of the work that we do right now, again, is largely focused on telecommunication restoration. So one of our biggest partners is a group called Net Hope, which focuses a lot on bringing internet back online after natural disasters. We work quite a bit with the World Food Program Emergency Telecommunication Clusters, which plays a similar role, not only trying to deploy IT and logistics staff, but to make sure that populations can come back online. I would say on hopefully what is a slightly more positive side of the story, comparatively speaking to other refugee crises we see in the world, internet connectivity in this region is much better. And so where there are still places where infrastructure needs to be supported, I think Facebook does play a role in trying to work with nonprofits doing that work. But we also are comforted by the fact that compared to places like, where the Rohingya live, where we really struggle to get information through internet sources in those places, we are encouraged by the amount of connectivity that is available.
Thank you, Laura. Alejandro Machado, he's the founder of Open Money Initiative. He's a brilliant Venezuela product designer. He has worked for technology startups like Spotify and the Zcash Foundation. He's, as I said, the founder of Open Money Initiative, an organization that researches the creation of technology products to empower economic access around the world. He's an expert on Venezuela, on cryptocurrency, specifically on Venezuela's cryptocurrency ecosystem. We're delighted to have you here, Alejandro. Thank you for coming. What is the role of cryptocurrency in Venezuela? Is this a fantasy? Is this a reality? And specifically looking at remittances, you have heard the other panelists talking about the importance of remittances.
Absolutely.
So what does this mean in your context, and tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, thanks Moises for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. This is a very important topic, and I think one of the things that we have to realize is that technology can make a huge difference in people's lives. And I have just Facebook sitting here right next to me. They know this, and you said, for example, I just want to bring it back before we even talk about money. Let's talk about how we can connect to people in Venezuela, because it's hugely different. How does the Cuban diaspora communicate with Cuba, like with the Cuban families? They have no way to do so, mostly because there's no internet access there. We have the immense privilege, and I think hopefully we look back and to this point and say, well, this is the reason why we were able to make it work. This is the reason why we were able to organize effectively and to enact change in Venezuela and to bring back democracy, because precisely we have the great privilege of being able to talk to Venezuelans, even though with all the communication problems, the internet, the blackouts, it's still possible. Like, WhatsApp works. Every Venezuelan phone has WhatsApp. There's 14 million phones in the country still operational. So this is a huge opportunity to still enact change, because if we organize ourselves well, and I also love the name of this panel, the hidden power of the diaspora. If we unlock that power well, if we're able to organize and to communicate effectively between the people who are outside and the people who are inside, which we can still do. And I think it's important to remark on the fact that we can still do it, and the time window may be closing because the government has shown that they want to close that window. So I think there's plenty of opportunity and plenty of hope. Now bringing it more closely to the issue of money, if you've been paying attention, this is still very early, but I really believe this is happening right now. Money is becoming information. With the advent of cryptocurrencies, it's possible to send money just by using native internet instruments. You don't need to have money inside a bank to transfer value from one place to the other. You don't need to have a bank account to be able to transact in foreign currency. And this is transformational. We're still very, very early, so it's very difficult to see, but it's something that will change the course of history. And I think that, for example, to empower the Venezuelans who have no access to any kind of bank account, like we all here are very privileged, and we're very lucky that all of our families back home have access to our bank accounts and our services that we are provided by the financial system, but 95% of Venezuelans don't have access to any kind of other money. So what do they do when they get their salaries in a hyperinflating currency that every 18 days, like the prices double? They just rush to the stores, they try to buy flour, try to buy eggs, they try to buy anything that holds value better than the Bolivar. And right now, that's the way they can do it, but cryptocurrencies are often an alternative to that. They can store value better by using a different kind of monetary system. And this is what we're focused on in the Open Money Initiative. We know that the technology is already here, but there's a huge human bridge to bridge. that we need to focus on design research and to catering to these like very vulnerable populations. How do we design technology products that are catered to this, to the average person who has WhatsApp on their phone, or who has not a smartphone but other devices, or doesn't even have a phone? Can we design services that rely on this new technological infrastructures that already allow for the transfer of value, to really include them in an open financial system, and to allow them to use an alternative to their hyperinflating currency? Because if you think about it, a big chunk of the power of the Venezuelan government that is oppressing the people today comes from the fact that they can devalue the currency at any time. They can print money, and every time they do so, they will make everyone poorer, and the people are just becoming like slaves that just work for like fiction money. And if we can send, for example, remittances and hard money, that changes the equation completely, because then you can enable an economy that still exists today. There is a like black market economy, but it's still very limited to the fringes of Venezuelan society that have still access to dollar accounts, and to, for example, the people that live near the border, they're pacifying now, like the Colombian peso is making inroads into the country, and we've seen this in Zimbabwe in 2008, 2009. This is permeating Venezuela, and it's only a matter of time until either the government shuts down every kind of access to information and money, which hopefully they won't be able to, or we can enable flows of money and information that unlock the power of the Venezuelan workforce that's still there, that's still fighting and still struggling for freedom.
Thank you, Alejandro. Just pointing back on that issue of remittances, Venezuela is becoming a remittances country. It's usually known as the oil country. The main income for Venezuela is oil. But now, as we see people fleeing the country, 4 million of Venezuelans living abroad, they're sending back remittances. So remittances kind of on the top right now of how Venezuela income takes shape. So this is where cryptocurrency is playing a major role as well, because people realize that using cryptocurrency as a remittance is not only more effective, less costly, but it's also outside of the control of the Venezuelan regime. So it's a powerful tool that we probably haven't thought too deep about it, but I think it's worthwhile taking a closer look. And I want to point, Alejandro, I want to ask you this question very briefly, if you can take 2 minutes. We're not talking about Petro, which is the Venezuela's regime cryptocurrency backed so-called cryptocurrency.
Right.
And you and I talk. This is it's not really real. No, you can't buy it, you can't sell it. So we're talking about independent cryptocurrencies. Tell us a little bit about Petro. Tell us a little bit about the risks, vulnerabilities. Is money laundering an issue when it comes to cryptocurrency? We're talking about one of the most corrupted governments in the world right now. So
right.
Is cryptocurrency playing any type of role in this type of risk and vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so let's start with the Petro. It's the easiest one to debunk. The Petro, you should see it as the Venezuelan attempt to create the Cuban convertible peso in Venezuela. That's all it is. They want to pay people in bolivars, worthless money, and they want to potentially exercise some fiscal responsibility over this new currency, kind of like what they did in Brazil with the Plan Real. The problem, as you know, is that the Venezuelan government, they don't have the best track record in maintaining a currency peg. And I believe that the Cubans may be helping them to establish this like new currency and the credibility of another independent central bank. And so if they succeed, what they'll effectively create is the Cuban system, where people can send remittances back to the country in this like Petro, or the Cuban convertible peso in the case of Cuba. But then the people themselves have very little access to this, because the government can take the money in the convertible currency and then pay the people that are becoming basically slaves in this very inferior currency that like they can control at will. So I think that's all that needs to be said. It's whether it is a cryptocurrency or not, I think it's kind of irrelevant. What's very clear is that it's controlled by the government, and cryptocurrency was born out of the idea that it's good to check the government's power of being able to print money at will, and you can look at it as privately issued money, and we can debate whether it's volatile. The value of the dollar, like it goes up and down. It has many problems. It's still not ready. Like the technology is still very early, but it is an alternative, and no one's forcing anyone to use it. So I think that as long as it's possible to use censorship-resistant kinds of money to bring hard currency into Venezuela, I think it's going to be a net positive. And we should worry about the potential for money laundering. It's definitely a possibility. Like right now, history hasn't shown that it's like Bitcoin and the free cryptocurrencies are an ideal vehicle for that, because they're still very traceable. The FBI and other government agencies have a lot of tools to analyze blockchains and to have insights into who is laundering money and so on. If you want to tackle money laundering, you better check out Russian real estate or there's many other vehicles that are way bigger, like even banks, like HSBC launders way more money than has ever been laundered using cryptocurrency. So we're still talking about theoretical risks. I think it's important to keep them in mind, but cryptocurrency should be seen as a tool on par with encrypted communications. It's a very useful tool to be able to provide freedom to people and to provide especially economic freedom. So.
Great, thank you, Alejandro. I'm gonna put a question on the table for all of the panelists. I'm gonna ask you to take 1 minute, if not 2, but not more than 2, to make sure that we have time for Q&A from the audience. And it's a very general question, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. And so we talk about the gaps, the opportunities that offer the Venezuelan diaspora, and tools like social media, cryptocurrency, and medical doctors, for example. But what remains to be done? If each of you can tell us 1 or 2 steps, 1 or 2 gaps that remains, that needs to be worked out for the Venezuelan diaspora to fully flourish and to fully mobilize. So what are 1 or 2 concrete steps and gaps that you see that needs to be done right now for the Venezuelan diaspora? Let's start with Professor Sanchez, if you don't mind, and let's go over the table like this, and then we go to the audience.
Well, a very challenging question, as always, Moises. I want to stay in the level of the academic, I would say, because it's an area that I know. I mean, has the highest skill academic and science all around the world, Venezuelans all around the world. I would say one of the challenge and the ideas that we have been discussing around in different networks, LASA, other Congress Association, etc., still how is that possible to establish connection with platforms of knowledge in Venezuela when we know for sure that it's completely collapsed? It's a systemic collapse. It's a very difficult situation to connect with the internet. So you can give a class, a simultaneous class by Skype, you can participate in the things, and then suddenly the connection fell. So that would be one of the most challenging. I mean, in my opinion, to relate with Venezuela, because we can have challenge organizing the diaspora outside, and that we have tools and technology and a lot of ganas, if we say, right, in Spanish, will. But how to really establish that connection that will be really successful with the country of origin?
Thank you.
And
yeah, Pancho.
I think there are a lot of things that we can do. At least 2 that we're trying to work on is, the first one's data. I think it's very difficult to have really up-to-date data, and Alexandra gives a perfect example. She wants to find Venezuelan doctors. She needs Venezuelan doctors. Where can she find them? I mean, there's a couple websites, there's a Facebook group here and there, but it's not, scalability is what we talked about. You need that data. I mean, my dream would be that we have these massive data sets or these mechanisms in which to say, hey, you know, there are doctors in these cities, in different cities of the world, or, you know, where are the engineers, or where are the lawyers, et cetera. I mean, I think we need to have more robust data and create mechanisms for sharing that data, because that's the second. Because it's not as meaningful if one organization has the data and then, you know, no one can look at it, no one can share it. I think those are two huge concerns. And third, I think that we need to be very adamant about creating spaces for Venezuelans to meet, talk to each other, share information, share initiatives. I think those two aspects are very important because, you know, if I think Alexandra and some of us has talked about it, if you don't want to create redundant efforts. And that's one of the aspects that we're trying to work on right now. There's a lot of goodwill, and sometimes you might be thinking that nobody's doing that, but there's been a group doing that for 3 years, and you're like, oh, wow, I'm 6 months in. What a shame. Yeah. So I think those are some of the challenges and some of the steps that we can concretely take right now.
Thank you, Pancho.
Absolutely agree with Francisco. I mean, if Visión Democrática can partner with Facebook just today so you guys can share that data, you would make my life much easier. But other than that challenge, for the medical society and the medical community from Venezuela, it's a challenge that the government does not recognize the importance of humanitarian aid inside the country. Everybody asks, Alexandra, you're doing great efforts, or MedGlobal and University of Miami are doing great efforts towards relieving healthcare situations on the border. But what do we do to actually relieve the healthcare crisis inside the country? And I just want to take as an example, for example, when we were working in Syria, one of our biggest benefits was that the United Nations Security Council in 2017, they issued a resolution which would allow cross-border and cross-conflict humanitarian access into Syria. That resolution is actually until January 2019, so that it would have to be renewed. But that's how United Nations humanitarian agencies or implementing partners could actually go through different border crossings and send medical supplies, work on the ground, or maybe even bring Syrian doctors to train, which is something that we would also love to contemplate in the future. So I think definitely would be, how can we pressure the Venezuelan government towards opening those humanitarian channels and finding a way also to keep training Venezuelan doctors, but also making sure we're also creating resilience for the Venezuelan people on the ground with healthcare and trying to overcome those healthcare disparities.
Thank you, Alex.
I would echo what Francisco and Alexandra have said in terms of, you know, it's interesting when you see the use of social media by communities that are hoping to do good. And it reminds me, honestly, a lot of problems that we face in the development space. Is that, I mean, you took the words out of my mouth, Francisco, but there are lots of people trying to do good, but figuring out ways to reduce duplication and have people not be trying to solve the same problem in sort of silos around the world is a real challenge. And so I think, again, what we've learned from our work in disaster response is that there are deeper partnerships that we can leverage to actually move to a place where, you know, 100 different smaller efforts are sort of splintered around the same issue, but trying to work at an organizational level to execute at scale and create, whether or not it's a Facebook page with 1.5 million users or a fundraiser that makes more than $100. I think that working to really coordinate and effectively build coalitions here is a challenge, but I'm motivated by those in this room that we, you know, if we focus our efforts, we can do it.
Thank you, Laura.
I think we have a huge need for common media. We don't have, I mean, the closest thing we have to a common media of the diaspora, I think, is Caracas Chronicles. I'm a big fan. I sometimes contribute, I write, but I think it's still a very niche audience of people who are mostly educated, they live in Western Europe or the US, and we have it's a very sophisticated audience. What if we could scale that and make more content in Spanish, more content for the people who are in Colombia, in Peru? How do they get the news, and how to make sure that they get credible, good information that's coming out of people that are living still in the country and elsewhere? I think we should really take advantage of the free information flow that still exists today. Because I mean, and also the propaganda arm of the government needs to be confronted, and because and it's very easy to spread news and spread things that turn out to be fake, and there can be this can fall under the purview of either Caracas Chronicles or other organizations to take into. It's just something that I think needs to exist. Also, that leads us to creating political bodies that exist outside the country as well, and become credible, complements to the opposition that still exists in Venezuela. Or we need to articulate. Even though we're outside Venezuela, we're still citizens of the country, and we still have a say, or should have a say, in what goes on there. And I think we have not come together and organized very well in that regard. People who, there's this feeling that, oh, you're outside, you don't have the right to make issue opinions anymore, and that's not true, because 10% of the population is already out. How much more do we have to wait until we actually become a political, viable political force? So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alejandro. You all been very patient. Thank you so much. Just say your name. We're gonna have one of our colleagues to hand you a microphone. We're just asking to say your name, your institution, and go straight to the question. Thanks. Yeah, one over there. Thank you. Then the ambassador on the first row.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to all the panelists and CSIS for organizing this very interesting event. My name is Roberta Romano. I work for the International Organization for Migration, IOM, in the Washington, D.C. office, and actually I'm the diaspora liaison person for the office here. So, of course, I'm extremely interested in everything you said, and I see huge potential for working together and for really leveraging each other's strength in a space of influence. As mine is just a quick comment on the need, maybe echoing on many of the things you were saying about the need also to interface with the international community that is responding to the crisis in Colombia and other neighboring countries, and how maybe linking up the community, the diaspora communities, and the efforts that you are trying to establish to better coordinate to the efforts on the ground can also maximize your effort and avoid the duplication that we were talking about. We're doing a similar work with diaspora from Bangladesh, Philippines, and Haiti, based in the US, specifically for response to natural disaster, how to channel better the work that these diasporas are already conducting independently, but coordinating them with the work of the cluster system, the UN country team, all these boring but relevant bodies that we represent. So we can maybe bring the conversation forward if you want. And so thank you.
Thank you. No, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Let's take one more question. Ambassador here has a question.
My name is John Masto. I'm a former United States ambassador to Venezuela. So I lived there. I want to commend CSIS for doing this. I came here not knowing what to expect. It's good that CSIS thinks out of the box, because frankly, people in Washington have to think more out of the box.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks.
So, comes to my question, and maybe a thought. You are a privileged diaspora, not you, because you're here. What is so alarming about the humanitarian crisis of Venezuela is the number of Venezuelans who are just out. You all know about Colombia, you all know about Peru, you know all about Ecuador and Brazil. A thought occurred to me listening to all of you as I tried to figure out where each of you was coming from, including a mention of my querida Acción Democrática. I thought I was going to get something political there, but I didn't quite get as much as I thought I would get.
No, but this is Visión Democrática. Very different.
That's another subject. However, you all represent the best of Venezuela, because it's the value, the strength of Venezuela, which have always been the Venezuelans, in spite of the crazy political situation that exists, and has existed even before 1998, by the way. I'm wondering if, in terms of dealing in a humanitarian way with the diaspora, a certain amount of it here in the United States, but much more alarming in the continent, there might be some way that you all could be working with the Colombians and the Peruvians and the Brazilians and the Ecuadorians. I'm sure that they would welcome an effort, and they would want to cooperate with you all doing things in their countries to help them alleviate. Point one, that's a humanitarian. Point two, it would really send a message to the continent and to here in the United States about the Venezuelans. Because if it's just going to be intellectual, if it's just going to be about studies, if it's just going to be about coming to CSIS, that ain't enough. Not today. So and by the way, all those embassies are about a block from here on Massachusetts Avenue, with the exception of, well, Peru and Brazil. But there are three big ones. So that's a thought I leave you with, particularly, Alejandro, what you have had to say in your last comments about, and this is an untapped strength today. And I don't understand it all that much because I'm of another generation, but you all do. So there are opportunities here, and maybe CSIS could help in that as well.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Really appreciate your comments. We all have a lot of food for thought here. If you have any comments to respond to either of the two people, that would be great. Yeah.
So regarding what Roberta said, yeah, we're definitely looking forward to have a conversation. So one of the things of the privileges of being here in DC is here at Vision, we've tried very hard to talk to the ambassadors here, talk to the multilaterals, talk to the US government, and always with one message is diaspora organizations want to be part of the solution. And for that is very important. And I'll give you a small example of how we actually got this done on the ground. There's this organization called Venezolanos en Cúcuta. They actually opened the first Casa Venezuela in Cúcuta. And because of first some diaspora members wanted to fund them, so we got that, we connected them. Then we actually linked them up with the World Food Program and UNHCR. And thanks to that, UNHCR is actually helping them revamp the house completely. They're going to start serving 1,000 meals every single day with the World Food Program. So that's just a small example of the type of power that can be done if you have local Venezuelan organizations with multilaterals. And so we're definitely trying to look at, again, we can't do it fast enough. That's usually the issue. We want to do a lot more of it. Scalability is one big aspect, and it really comes down to both funding and human capital. Lastly, Vision forms part of this something called Human Mobilization Coalition, where precisely there's been people from Ecuador, Colombia, a lot of countries, especially other NGOs. And I think that we were successful, but still more needs to be done for them to always have top of mind Venezuelan migrant organizations. Because a lot of times what has happened is the people helping Venezuelan migrants coming in are not Venezuelans, which is normal. But one of the things we're trying to do is get Venezuelans and the locals together to receive Venezuelans. We think that can be even more powerful. But I completely agree with the comments. We're trying to think in that regard and trying to move forward as fast as possible.
Yep.
Yeah, I want to echo the comments of former ambassador. Thank you for bringing that up. I think, yeah, there's a lot of value in being in Washington and being like a block away from these embassies and the World Bank and all these like important institutions that can provide a lot of help. And myself, I am in San Francisco for a month fundraising and trying to talk to technology stakeholders that support our mission and so on. But I think like our top priority is to get to Colombia and get to Peru and get to these places, like go actually live there for a while and interact with people who are like the direct victims of this crisis and they need to send money to their families. They are in pressing condition. We need to be able to live close to them or like them in many ways to be able to understand their problems. I think this is something that this is also actually why embassies exist. You need to send people to the different countries to be able to have relationships with them, and you need to like establish communications. So I think I would echo that. I would think that there's a lot of value in being in the U.S., and I'm very lucky myself to be in software, and software can be developed anywhere. I myself have spent time in Colombia and in Spain and in Portugal and other places where there's many Venezuelans, and I'm lucky to be able to move around and do that because my job mostly allows me to. But I would encourage more Venezuelans that want to help and have the flexibility. They're still young, they don't have deep roots in a place, to move to these places, at least temporarily, to really understand how they can help, because it's very difficult to just sit here and imagine how you can help. Thank you.
Well, regarding Roberta's comment, I'm going to take your support very seriously, because from Med Global and from University of Miami, we just recently were able to find out that IOM was creating a database between Colombian, Peru, and Ecuadorian databases of migration offices in order to find the way to identify patterns. For example, how many people have the PEP in Colombia, but they probably have the duplicated PEP in Peru? Or, for example, how many people were vaccinated in Colombia and don't have to be vaccinated in Ecuador? So when you start sharing that information, the diaspora effort will be much more targeted and will actually alleviate costs that were really important in this moment. So yes, we would love to work with OIM. And for example, regarding the ambassador's comment, I think that many of us who are on this table are part of a generation that began in 2007 with the student movement and with the whole, working towards against the Chavez government, but has still continued to have that same commitment to work for the country. Even though we're very privileged, even though we are in Washington, D.C., we're sitting here because we're still connected with home. So I think that's what makes our generation special, and we just hope for in the future to actually keep on working towards our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to point back to that again, yes, we're privileged, but that brings a responsibility for us to help. And that's why we're doing all of this, and we are going to continue doing it, because the suffering of those people living and staying in Venezuela is something that moves us and give us a reason, right, to wake up every day and do what we do. So thank you, Ambassador, for your comments. Yes, Rafael, then we have another one here.
One of the big issues is the documentation. People leave from Venezuela without passports. What's the possibility?
Can you say your name quickly?
Rafael Castillo. I work with Visión Democrática.
Great.
What possibilities? I think we've talked about it, Moises, about the possibility of using blockchain in identity. Like, the issue of passports is like there's no paper to print passports. There's no materials. But could blockchain be a possibility to use not only what Alexandra was just talking, like medical records? Could that be a possibility? That way, it's an open source. Every country could use it, and then there's no duplicates, no double investment.
I would say the blockchain technology is overhyped, incredibly overhyped. Right now, we know that blockchains are useful for money, for transmitting value from one place to the other. There are hypotheses that they might be good for medical records and for intemperable, like other kinds of records, but it's still research. I would not want to try to stop that research. I think it's very valuable, and I think it's worth pursuing. But I think the top problem here is not actually the technology itself, but what governments recognize it, because it's no use to have some passport on your phone on the blockchain if Colombian authorities will turn you down at the border anyways. It's more of a social and political problem rather than just like a technology problem, and that any kind of solution that you develop, blockchain or not blockchain, is going to take time for governments to accept it. So yeah, I think we're still at least a couple of years away from those kinds of solutions. I started out thinking about blockchain that way precisely. I was at a hackathon in Buenos Aires earlier this year, and we tackled exactly that use case of trying to use blockchains for providing identity solutions. But yeah, and there is promising like research in that direction, but it's all about what we're able to convince governments to take. And I would try to push for if passports are very difficult to accept or to get in Venezuela, how do we convince the Colombian government to take more people that don't have them, just like to take their ordinary cédulas, and and if they can't because they already are taking in too many refugees, how do we route around that problem and so on? But
yeah, on the same line, I always hear this expression that I think identifies well the issue. We're very early stage in this technology, in this blockchain technology, and we're like in the internet of 1990s. Now in 1992, 1993, we know there is potential, but there is a lot of hype on this. There's a lot of expectations. Many of those are very not real. But we don't know that yet. I mean, in 5 years, the ecosystem might change, might develop in a way that we don't see it today. As we saw the internet in 1992, we didn't know that we were going to hop in a stranger's car to go to places in 1992, right? And now we're doing it. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. It's the potential, and it's more like a long-term solution, at least from my perspective. But thank you for bringing that up. It's very important. Let's do one more last round of questions before time is up. Yeah, let's do one there and then one here. Yeah.
My name is Ramon Torres, and I'm an economics consultant here in DC. And for the last 4 years, me and a few friends have been trying to start a supply chain into Venezuela, and we've been using cryptocurrencies to do that. But it's been really hard. Like we've told people, and we usually would reach out to businesses and be like, "What do you need? We can get it to you. We have people in China, blah blah blah." And I will tell people, "Listen, we'll take your bolívares, but if you pay me on Bitcoin, I'll give you a discount." Just so that people will be like, "Oh, okay, I get a discount. Let me figure out how to do this Bitcoin thing." And then my idea is, if I do that, maybe the next time this guy will just pay me in Bitcoin, and I can save myself the trouble of taking the bolívares, switching into Bitcoin, switching it back to dollars, and blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't happen. Even with my own family, I told my dad, "Listen, once a month, we're going to take your pension, we're going to turn it into Bitcoin. So at least, sure, it fluctuates, but at least it fluctuates in both directions. It doesn't fluctuate just in one direction, right?"
Yeah.
And my dad is like, "Oh, yeah, okay, yeah," and like it doesn't happen, So I guess I'm curious about, from your perspective, what is it going to take? So I guess what's the next step, and then how can we make it? I don't know, what kind of products are you guys working on to facilitate that? I guess the next step, and how can the rest of us help out on that?
Thank you. Let's do one more question. Yes, on this side, please.
Hi, I'm Ninoska Marcano, and I'm a freelance journalist, among other things here. My question to all of you is, what are some of the challenges that the Venezuelan diaspora is facing in the midst of this U.S. current anti-immigrant policy? And of course, do you have any information campaigns to educate the population on the immigration issues here in the U.S.? Because I see that you're doing great work, and it's all about, the exodus of people, or the Venezuelans, going to Latin America. But what about the ones that are here who are desperate and hungry for information regarding, the immigration policies? There's a whole issue with the asylums going on that's unresolved. And as you said, we are the privileged ones, but there's a bunch of people out there who are desperately waiting answers under a terrible, government administration that is lashing against immigrants. So how do we stand out in the midst of all this? Again, if you have any vaccinations that are not in Colombia or Peru, but here, maybe in Virginia, the DMV area, and any other information pertaining to this. As you know, this is being broadcast. There's many people waiting to hear some sort of, aid or solutions to the problem.
Yes.
So if you could comment, I would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, appreciate it, thank you. Okay, let's do, feel free to, who wants to take that last question? Let's do that last question, and then Alejandro, you're gonna close up with the other question.
Thank you for your question. It's a very important question. I'm just gonna refer to examples that I know for sure, I know organizations that have been called Casa de Venezuela, For example, I know the organization in Philadelphia, and they work very well in the sense that they have a group of lawyers that can, in terms of identity documents, they can instruct the population that need it to see what are the channels to get the legal status. I would say yes, we are living anti-immigrant times in this country, but also I think it's a lot of organizations that are dealing with the situation of asylum population that are requesting that. What I know from the data is that the amount of application for from Venezuelan asylum it has been growing. We don't have data, public data yet, from Homeland Security, or at least in recent years, related with that. I'm not sure, and I'm not aware of the situation of Venezuelan immigrants in really bad conditions in terms of health issues that come to this country. I'm not aware of that, right? And it's different channels and organizations that can help in this country to immigrants that are in really bad shape. So that's
Thank you.
what I can do.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
I would just add, we've helped connect a couple of Venezuelans or different groups of Venezuelans with either volunteer lawyers or volunteer organizations here. Obviously, as I mentioned before, there isn't the capacity to serve all the requests, but what we have done sometimes, if you go to our social media at Visión Dem, we usually try to connect with other services, both here in the DMV area and in other parts of the United States, because we know it's a big issue. I understand also, just a small anecdote, this is really, it was unexpected for me. One of the political prisoners I was with, he comes from a very low-income, underserved community. He was actually able to move to Trinidad and Tobago because he got into cryptocurrency. And this is a young guy, he's 18. And I think there might be a generation thing, but I think there is a market for it. Also, since it's a new technology, there are a lot of people that see too many barriers, they don't understand it. And I'm no expert, but this is my anecdotal experience that I thought would be interesting.
No, yeah, thanks for the question. I think I would echo that. It's part of it is a generational thing, but just to point back to a reference, no one was using encrypted communications before WhatsApp rolled it out. No one cared about it. No one, there was like, people were messaging each other, but like the technology existed, and like you could send PGP emails from like the 80s or the 90s, right? But probably not many people here even know what PGP email is. It's like being able to encrypt an email and send it and protect it in transit so that no one can eavesdrop on it, just you and the recipient. And we are now used to that with WhatsApp and with Signal and other protocols. I think the same thing has to happen with cryptocurrency. There needs to be a product that encapsulates the use of cryptocurrency that is so easy to use, that is equivalent to the Venmo of cryptocurrency, right? Or the WhatsApp of money. And that hasn't happened yet. Like, you know, if you have experience just trying to like create the flow of money, you're probably familiar with local bitcoins. Local bitcoins is the prime exchange in Venezuela that has $1 million of volume a day. But still, that $1 million of volume comes from a very, very elite part of the population that really knows how to use technology very well. This is not a very user-friendly site. It only exists on the web, which means that most people don't have access to it because most people don't have computers anymore. They have phones. And there's no native app. There's no like nice interface for it. The usability is very, very dismal in the cryptocurrency world. And we need to bring in designers and change that. And this is what we're focusing on. We need to solve more like the human problem of understanding who the users are and how to cater to a mainstream audience. And it's definitely possible. Like we use services every day that, you know, Uber is very easy to use, Facebook is very easy to use, and these are things that they can be solved, and they just need to, like, there needs to be effort in that direction to understand how people, even, you know, the older generation, I can communicate with my grandma using WhatsApp today because she had to kind of learn it because of her need of connecting with us, who are now spread all across the world. And you know, it's something that, if there is a need that is pressing, and I think that the need for better money is very, very pressing, and there is a minimally usable product, people will just flock to that, and they will use it. And we're trying to tear down the barriers in that exist today, and there are definitely barriers that we can overcome.
And with that opportunity, note potential use of this technology, we're going to close this event. Thank you so much for all being here. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you for all the panelists for the great remarks. Thank you again.
Thank you.